Thank you all. Gregg Sandord. I have been here in Dane County for now 21 years doing kind of sustainability type research, first as a graduate student, then for about 15 years as a research scientist, and now I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Soil and Environmental Sciences, and talking about seeing beauty in nature and science in nature all around you. I got into this because of plants. I started off as a botanist, and then I became an agronomist, and then I realized that soils are kind of like this magical engine beneath all of our agricultural systems driving things, and so that has kind of led what I've been doing for the last 15 or 16 years. And a huge part of that has been this concept of carbon sequestration, particularly in natural systems. My hope today is to kind of set the stage for Michelle, just with some general overview of the concept of carbon sequestration. Sequestration is kind of an evocative word. It makes me think of like a monk cloistered in a cell that never comes out. Hopefully by the end of today, we have a more kind of like nuanced concept of the way that it's discussed in terms of natural systems. The first thing I just want to touch base on, and I think probably everybody in this room is aware of this, is kind of the why of carbon sequestration. Why are we here talking about it? And to do like a kind of high school type primer, our interest and obsession in some ways in carbon sequestration comes from the idea of the impact of CO2 in particular, but greenhouse gases on our planet's climate. This idea that we have solar radiation coming in, roughly 50% of which, 55% of which is reaching the soils and the oceans, and then some proportion of that energy stays here, but some proportion of it is re-radiated out to space. And as it's being re-radiated, the kind of composition of our atmosphere impacts how much stays and how much goes, right? So certainly things like water vapor and clouds are huge in terms of holding on to radiation and re-radiating them back to Earth. But so are kind of classic greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and then hydrocarbons, fluorocarbons in particular. When we think about this, the Earth's atmosphere is primarily nitrogen, dinitrogen gas, N2. There's also a huge proportion of oxygen. Carbon dioxide makes up less than 1% of the total air that we're breathing on a daily basis. But when we look at terms of like its impact on greenhouse gas emissions, it's the most prominent from a quantity standpoint greenhouse gas, roughly 76% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Followed by methane, also a carbon emission, and then nitrous oxide. But it's one of the least potent of our greenhouse gases. So we tend to set all of our kind of global warming potential when we talk about greenhouse gases on a base level of CO2. So we talk about things in CO2 equivalents. So we set CO2 at 0. Methane then here in the tiny little yellow bar is 25. Nitrous oxide is about 300, and then the fluorocarbons can be thousands of kind of equivalents from a CO2 standpoint. So carbon is a huge wedge in the total amount of atmospheric greenhouse gases we're releasing, and their impact on climate has kind of it's different whether it's methane or CO2. I would just say that CO2, because it's so much, 78% of all greenhouse gases, tends to be the one that we focus on the most. Why do we care about it beyond the climate piece? Well, anytime there's a potential for valorizing ecosystem services or valorizing credits, energy credits, carbon credits, it means that there's big money at stake. So these are just some recent headlines. Puro Earth secures 11 million euros as NASDAQ backs engineered carbon removal boom. So we are going to briefly touch on the engineered piece. The UN has its own kind of carbon markets office. Then I don't know if people have heard about Indigo Ag, this carbon by Indigo, this idea that like natural climate solutions, which we'll talk about here in a second, you could grow trees or you could grow certain crops. You could sequester carbon. Farmer gets paid for that carbon. Google gets to have their AI, energy generation, whatever. That's the basic idea. And there's a whole suite of third-party kind of verification protocols out there. Vera is a big standard globally. But when there's money, things become, bigger and bigger, and the kind of gold rush, as it were, for sequestering carbon has really taken off, I would say, in the last 10 years. 15 or 16 years ago, when I started doing carbon sequestration work, the Chicago Climate Exchange was kind of coming online, but it was more or less a failed attempt, and it wasn't really going anywhere. So I just want to touch base before we get into natural climate solutions, which is going to be the focus of today's conversation, this idea of carbon capture. There are a tremendous amount of brilliant people out there working on engineering solutions for CO2 sequestration. These are just some headlines from the New York Times. New climate gold rush, scrubbing carbon from the sky. Norway's hedged bet on Europe's energy future, a garbage disposal for emissions. These are all kind of engineered techniques to take CO2 out of the atmosphere and pump it really, really deep into the earth with the idea that it would stay deep in the earth and remove it from the atmosphere. But then, this is also in a recent headline, carbon capture comes back down to earth. Just, this kind of gold rush or whatever for these engineered solutions was hopping in the previous administration, and now it's questionable kind of where it's going. In the US, I will say that Europe continues to move forward with these ideas. And then you might hear, and this is where I'm going to start hedging away from the engineered piece into the kind of natural climate solutions piece, of things like enhanced rock weathering. I'm just throwing these out there in case you see a news article or something like this. I would say that enhanced rock weathering is this kind of hardcore chemistry, natural climate solution that people are really excited about and talking a lot about. The idea here is that you take silicate rocks, and those volcanic silicate rocks are ground. They could be a byproduct from a mining industry, but they're ground and they're spread on a farm field, or they're spread in forested land or whatever. And they lay on the soil surface, and as rain falls through the sky, it picks up CO2 that's in the atmosphere. It dissolves in the water becomes slightly acidic. And then when that slightly acidic water reacts with the volcanic rock that you've spread on your field, carbonates are generated, like calcium carbonate. But basically, we all of a sudden have inorganic carbon that's been generated as the rain reacts with the silicate rocks. And then the idea is that those percolate through the soil, or they run off the soil, make their way into the oceans, rivers, lakes, are buried and sequestered. This process happens naturally all over the world. Anywhere silicate rocks are exposed to kind of slightly acidic rainfall. The whole point here is that it's enhanced rock weathering. We're trying to increase the surface area by grinding these materials and spreading them on the surface of the soil. So in my mind, this is kind of like a bridge between what I would consider a very engineered kind of take on carbon sequestration, pumping it underground, and moving us toward this idea of a natural climate solution. Here, it's an abiotic natural climate solution. And what we're really going to focus on today, Michelle and I, is the biotic portion of the natural climate solutions. And I'm going to use this just broadly, this term natural climate solution, as a kind of venue into soil organic carbon. This is a paper that came out in 2017 by Bronson Griscom. It was followed by a paper looking at U.S. potential for these natural climate solutions. A few years later, by Fargione, and the idea was, what could we possibly do on our working lands to sequester carbon? And I'm sure that if I, asked you for input, we would hear reforestation, prairie restoration, wetland restoration. There's all these things with, potentially different impacts because of the total acreage that they cover and the total amount of greenhouse gases they could potentially sequester or reduce. Forestry and forest sequestration in trees tends to get kind of the most attention because we can see that carbon being fixed, right? You plant a forest and you can essentially watch stocks of carbon growing on the soil. But there's an increasing body of research. This is from INRA in France, that's showing that most of the carbon that is being sequestered in natural systems is actually occurring in wetlands and soils. And we'll get to kind of the pools and maybe why some of that is, but it's also critical to just realize, as we've experienced the summer observing these Canadian wildfires, these hazy skies, that those sequestered above ground carbon stocks are very much threatened by the changing climate, the drying, heating climate. So another reason why sequestration in soils and or wetlands provides maybe a bit more buffer than that. So soil organic carbon, what is it? How does it get there? Where does it go? Bear with me, this is kind of like a soil biogeochemistry 101 a primer. Here's our soil. We have this pool of soil organic carbon, SOC. Where does it come from? Well, it all starts from autotrophic organisms, primary production. So here we have a corn plant. It could be whatever plant you want it to be. It could be big blue stem, it could be a tree, whatever. We have sunlight, water, carbon dioxide. Then we have this magic of nature, photosynthesis, that takes that CO2 and turns it into plant structures. Cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin, proteins, amino acids, all of the things that plants make to do their thing. And while those plants are growing, they're building these carbon stocks. And as they are harvested or die, we have residues from those plants making their way into the soil. It could be the roots, it could be the shoots, it could be whatever, but it's making its way into the soil, and we would call this unprotected carbon or coarse plant litter input. And that becomes part of the soil organic carbon pool, but it's kind of like the first step in the soil organic carbon pool. Much of the stuff that sticks around is carbon that's been processed in some way, shape, or form by microbes. So it could be bacterial turnover, it could be fungal decomposition, but we have these fungal and bacterial processes that end up leading to things like physically protected carbon. The carbon gets decomposed by the microbes, those microbes die, the microbe bodies stick to clay surfaces, they get stuck inside soil aggregates, and these slow processes kind of lock that carbon into the system. There's also some amount of biochemically protected carbon. This is carbon that's maybe complex and hard for many organisms to break down. Big, complex chemical molecules, particularly important in fire-dominated systems. So in forests with a fire regime, in tall grass prairies with a fire regime, those fires generate pyrogenic carbon that's super complex and hard for microbes to break down. Okay, but as these microbes are chewing on that carbon and creating these like protected pools, they're also respiring, just like, when you're eating your banana or your treat, you're like pulling some of that carbon into your body, but some amount of it's coming back out as you respire CO2. And that respiration of CO2, even though it's hard to imagine, has its own mass, and that mass is being lost from the soil. So we call this heterotrophic respiration. The system is sending CO2 back into the atmosphere. And so when you think about this total pool, it's really just a simple kind of mass balance. It's a balance of all the net primary production going into the system, and then kind of what stays and what the microbes fire, and this kind of simple mathematical equation ends up giving you what your total pool is. The problem is it's really hard to measure that total pool, and that total pool changes very slowly. In any given year, CO2 efflux from heterotrophic organisms could outweigh NPP inputs, and vice versa. It's kind of going back and forth every year. So, this year we had a lot of rain. It's been really warm. My guess is that there's a lot going on this side, and we'll see at the end of the season if kind of the inputs are sufficient to offset those losses. And like everything in science, nothing occurs in a vacuum. Precipitation and temperature are huge. Temperature, of course, drives this. Of course, there's also a Goldilocks zone for those microbes. They like to be at about 60% water-filled pore space. If it's too wet, they don't really like it. If it's too dry, they don't really like it. And then things like soil texture, what minerals are there, nutrients, the actual microbial composition. And then I guess this is maybe the kind of crux that'll get into what Michelle's working on at the management piece: litter quality, litter quantity, soil disturbance, etc. I want to throw this in there because we're going to talk a lot about the climate piece, but soil carbon is considered kind of the reigning king or queen of soil health indicators. So there's a climate impact to having soil carbon, but building soil carbon also improves soil structure and aeration, which are critical for gardening, farming. It helps reduce erosion, so you've got erosion control, water regulation, water purification. Our soils are our best filters for contaminants of our waters. Cation exchange capacity. Soil carbon has a CEC, cation exchange capacity, that's roughly 200 milliequivalents per kilogram of soil. And that's, maybe 2 or 3 orders of magnitude more than some of our clay minerals. So the ability of soil organic matter to exchange nutrients with crops is pretty phenomenal. And then enhanced nutrient cycling. So if we're looking to produce quality and quantity of food, feed, clean water, carbon is a key piece of that. I'm going to run out of time here, which is totally fine. I just want to say quickly that one of the reasons we care so much about the soil carbon bit is that we have, some terrestrial pools. Atmospheric carbon is about 2% of the total global carbon cycle, and these are in petagrams. One petagram is about 192 Great Pyramids of Giza. So 2% of our carbon is in our atmosphere, 1% is in all of the living things on top of the earth and in the oceans, including us. And roughly 8%, a whopping 8% is in the soil. So in terms of management, our biggest pool here is our soil pool. It has a huge kind of driving force for the rest of the climate. When we think about the potential for our working lands to sequester carbon, it's important to realize that since kind of the beginning of human cultivation, we believe we've lost about 133 petagrams. So 133 times 192 Great Pyramids worth of carbon from the top 2 millimeters of the soil. And this is a huge potential opportunity, or if you will, like a debt that we could attempt to rebuild through appropriate land management. And the idea is, bringing it to kind of southern Wisconsin, where we have prairies. For 3,000 years, prairies built our soils. In about the mid-1800s, we brought the moldboard plow in, started turning those prairies over. We had a huge loss of soil carbon, in some cases 50% of total carbon in our soils. And the question now is, what can we do to try to remediate that? We can continue to drive the carbon down, but what can we do to try and drive it up? If we look at Midwest cropping systems, I'm going to go a little bit fast here, but try not to lose you all. This is the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems Trial. It's now 36 years old here in southern Wisconsin. Longest running rotational grazing research in the state, longest running organic cropping system research in the state. But the trial is set up with grain systems and forage systems, which are conventional and organic, and then a suite of grassland systems. And when we look at 30 years of carbon stock change in these systems, we see some interesting trends. So the vertical axis here is change in metric tons of carbon per hectare per year. The units don't matter so much as the fact that this is change over time. So the 0 line here means there has been no change in the past 30 years. If the boxes and the whiskers fall below those lines, we've lost carbon, and if the boxes and the whiskers are above those lines, we've gained carbon. These systems are roughly representative of a vast swath of southern Wisconsin. Continuous corn, no-till corn, soybean, organic corn, soy, wheat, and then forages with alfalfa, corn and corn silage and manure, rotational grazing and prairie. And what I just want to show you is that if we look at the surface horizons, the top 15 centimeters, all of our grain systems have lost carbon. Our forage systems have kind of held on to it, and our grassland systems have built it over the last 30 years. But if we look at the whole top meter of the soil profile, the picture changes, and we actually find that our forage systems and our grain systems are net negatives, losing carbon. And it's only the grassland systems at this long-term experiment that have been able to maintain that. So here is my quick end, which is just to say that one of the ties with the work Michelle is doing is that we have this large regional soil organic carbon network where we're looking at these trends in deep carbon across a swath of research and on-farm sites here in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa, and partnering closely with Michelle and her work in Dane County on some of this. So I'm going to pass it on to Michelle.
Thank you, Gregg. Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Probst. I work with our Dane County Land and Water Resources Department. Thank you, Gregg, and that was a great setup for kind of these global issues around carbon, what's happening regionally, but then also, kind of setting the stage for us of why do we really care about soil and specifically soil carbon at a local level, right? First, we live in a community that very much is think globally, act locally, right? And so this project is really putting that into play. The big reason that we are looking at soil organic carbon and how soil has the ability to sequester carbon is that we have this county goal for our county operations to be carbon neutral by 2030. So in 5 years for us to be carbon neutral. And if you don't know about our climate action plan, there's a few folks here from that office. Otherwise, go online and check out our climate action plan. That's my little plug for that. So to get our county operations to neutrality, what we're looking at here, this graph is probably hard for you all to read. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted. Okay, so if we look here at kind of these like beige or brown lines here, these are the total emissions that are generated through our county admissions, right? So through our fleet usage, through our facilities, right? This is what we generate by us as Dane County offering services, right? Okay, so as you see, what's really great is that line is going down. It's going down because we're cutting emissions. We're putting in resources. We're investing in renewable energy to cut those emissions down. If any of you have been involved in this type of work, I'm sure you have realized that there are a lot of roadblocks to being emissions at completely zero, right? So, for us, it may be that we're tied into a steam grid that powers downtown, right? So some of those things that provide a lot of challenges to get off of that type of energy and get that emissions to zero. So this is where we can look at our nature-based solutions, right? So we can look at how we're managing land to be able to sequester carbon. I think this is cutting in and out, is it? Okay, all right, okay, anyways. With that comes in the green bars of this, green bars in this graph. So our goal is essentially that maybe we're still emitting some emissions through our county operations and activities, but we're actually sequestering through our land-based activities to where those are equal, and that's how we are going to get to our carbon neutral goal. So this is where our Dane County Land and Water Resources Department comes in, right? Because we do a lot of land management within our department. So within our department, we have 5 different divisions. So we have our Land Conservation Division, who works with private landowners, farmers to install conservation practices. We have our entire Dane County Park system. If you're not familiar with it, please go and visit one of our parks because it's amazing. We have our Stormwater Management and Engineering Unit, who mainly works in urban environments, preventing urban runoff and erosion control. Our Lakes Management Team obviously manages the lakes. And then finally, we have our Watershed and Ecosystem Services team that I'm a part of. And we work among all of these different divisions to really quantify the environmental benefit of what they are doing on the landscape. And so this is how we get involved in the work that we're doing on the landscape, but then also get involved in quantifying what that work looks like and how it then gets us to our climate goals. So Gregg set the stage perfectly, and when we are talking about how we can sequester and build carbon in our soils, it's really this this quite simple formula, right, of increasing our inputs and decreasing our losses. So to increase inputs, we want to maximize our living, diverse rooting systems, and to decrease losses, we want to minimize soil disturbance. So what really puts this into practice, what that looks like on the landscape, is the tallgrass prairie system that we once had here that covered most of Wisconsin. As Gregg shared, especially once colonial settlement happened, we started putting in annual cropping systems, right? So we're looking at plants that are just here for the growing season. We harvest them and plant a whole new crop the next year. Versus a perennial system puts this formula into play to try to maximize soil carbon in the soil, right? So the beauty, again, of us working on the landscape in Dane County is that we have a lot of conservation practices and programs that actually put this in play, right? And help landowners convert from that annual cropping system into a perennial type system. And so I'm going to talk about two of our main programs that we work to quantify what the carbon sequestration benefit could be from these programs. So our first program is our continuous cover program. I'm probably going to just call it CCP. So just so you know, CCP, continuous cover program. CCP is available to private landowners in Dane County, and it funds them to convert land that was once row crop, annual based cropping system, and we will provide cost share and a rental payment for 15 years to convert that property from an annual based system into continuous vegetative cover. And so the practices that you can enroll in are on the left-hand side of the screen here, but it's basically transitioning to that perennial based system. Again, you're enrolled in this program for about 15 years, so it is a long-term program, and this program is fairly new to us. If any of you are familiar with the Conservation Reserve Program that is through USDA and NRCS, this is the county's version of that. So kind of open it up so more landowners could get involved with that program. And it's been a very popular program within our county, and it's something that is continually being able to fund it, new acres enrolled, which is really great to see. So that's our first program that we really feel kind of increases these inputs of carbon and decreases those losses of carbon in our soils. Second is the restoration work that we are doing in our Dane County Parks system. So again, our Dane County Parks system, if you're not familiar with it, it is over 18,000 acres and growing. It's a very large park system. And it's actually ever growing each year, which is wonderful. Traditionally, when we buy property to become part of our parks program, it typically comes to us within an agricultural use. And typically that's, again, an annual cropping system. And then our natural areas team that is within our Dane County Parks system works to restore that agriculture land back to prairie. So our natural areas team really does everything in the restoration process. Our natural areas team and an incredibly robust volunteer force that we have with our Dane County Parks system. And we do everything from the seed collection to planting the seeds to managing invasives, removing weeds, doing controlled burning, all a part of that restoration process. And so you can see here we do have a lot of land within our park system, and right now we really only have the capacity to manage about a third of the park's land that we have. A lot of it is still within agriculture, and a lot of it is unmanaged as well. So when we look at both of these programs, restoration, our Dane County Parks, and our continuous cover program, it really has us asking a lot of these questions. Can carbon be sequestered through these programs? How are we going to measure it? And then overall, what benefit does that help us reach our climate action goals? And that is where it's super, super lucky to have UW, and specifically Gregg, right in our backyard, because it can help us try to answer these questions and get to some solutions. So what we know from Gregg's work is that, carbon sequestration in the soil takes a long time. It takes a long time, and carbon is stored very deep in the soil. However, direct measurement of the soil to understand how carbon is changing over time, that's going to be our most accurate information. A way to say, yes, is carbon building in the system, or no, is it not? Direct measurements are going to be our most accurate information. Again, however, we have our 2030 goal of climate neutrality, which is only 5 years away. And so for us to be able to try to prioritize what we should be doing as a county, we kind of need some answers now, right? And that is where modeling really comes into play. Modeling can actually help us forecast how carbon moves through the soil ecosystem, how it'll be sequestered and accumulate within the soil. I'll go more into the tool that we're using to model soil carbon, but our approach is to do both, because as we know with models and forecasting, like yes, there's some room for error. There's no doubt about that. But if we're also doing the in-field sampling as well, we can do that to help check the model and make sure that we are accounting for these things as accurately as possible. So let's talk about the direct measurement of soil carbon. So this map, which is, probably really, really difficult to see. It is a map of Dane County, and there's all these wonderful pink dots that are scattered throughout our entire county, and these sites are included in our soil carbon monitoring. So that is roughly about 3,500 acres represented through this sampling. About 1,000 acres are like newly planted Dane County Parks prairies. Prairies within our Dane County Parks system. And then we have our continuous cover program, which is about 2,500 acres. And those are all a part of our monitoring sites. So we go out and we sample all of these sites for soil carbon so that we can know right now what are we at for a baseline? What are soil carbon levels like now? Because again, as Gregg shared, they've changed a lot over time. And so we need to know where we're starting right now. And I don't know how to get this to play. Maybe? Okay, all right, awesome. So again, we know from Gregg's work that soil carbon is stored very deep in the soil. So we need to be measuring down to about 1 meter or 3 feet roughly. And so we have this handy dandy soil probe that saves my back, but also helps us get soil samples very efficiently. So once we get the core, the soil core out of the ground, we actually divide it up into 15 and 30 centimeter increments. And that's because, again, this is all informed, all of these methods that we're doing, this is all Gregg's. So thank you to Gregg for helping us with this methodology. But so that we can look at how soil carbon changes as you go down in depth and how it changes at depths over time, right? And so that helps us answer a lot of questions. So we're doing our baseline sampling. We just kind of finished up our baseline sampling, actually. And so now, so 2023, 2024 were my big sample years. I'm going to come back in 5 years, resample, 10 years, resample, 15, etc. Because again, this is a really long-term process. So I'm in this project for the long haul, and it's great. I should say we take those samples to UW Soil and Forage Lab for analysis. Okay, so again, really long-term project that we're a part of, and a long-term monitoring project that we're doing. So again, now we're thinking, okay, we need these answers now, right? We need to be able to say, okay, our land-based activities can be has the potential to sequester this much carbon, right? And again, this is where modeling helps us, and helps us make informed decisions as well. So we're utilizing Comet Farm, which is a tool that's developed by USDA and Colorado State University. Comet Farm is this nice tool where I can plug in all the management information, the field information, and then it runs DayCent, which is a soil carbon model, and it runs the model in the background for me. So I don't need to be a modeler, which is good. I can just plug in management information. So how it works, so this is an example of a field. This is a 100-acre field that is out at Walking Iron Wildlife Area, which is just outside Mazomanie. We did a 100-acre prairie planting there. And so what you do in Comet Farm is you give a baseline information on the field, right? So at this field, it came to us in Dane County Parks in a typical cash grain rotation, so corn and soybean, right? And then in the future restoration, we're going to do a prairie restoration, right? So that's our future management. So what COMET does is it actually models your baseline and it models your future scenarios. So it'll say, okay, say from 2025 to 2035, say you just continued to farm it, business as usual, right? What emissions and sequestration result from that? And then it'll look at your future scenario and it'll say, okay, all right, you're gonna restore a prairie. What do emissions and sequestration look like under this new management scenario? And I should say it looks at soil carbon, but it also looks at other greenhouse gases. Because one thing we didn't really get into, and maybe I can do this in 30 seconds, is really soil is kind of the nexus of a lot of our greenhouse gases, right? So not only carbon, the carbon cycle is very much involved in soils, but also the nitrogen cycle is, the soils are really, I don't know, the heart of it? Can we say that? Sure. Okay. All right. So it looks at a lot of other greenhouse gases besides just soil carbon storage. And so what this model outputs is something like this for each individual field. So again, I'm sorry if this graph is small, but so when we look at this graph, I like to visualize this zero line as like the topsoil, right? The top of the soil, okay? So anything that's negative in this case is going into the ground. So that's good, right? We want it in the ground. Versus anything positive is going out into the atmosphere. Not something we really want, right? So on the left-hand side, this is the agriculture scenario right here, right? So you see that, yeah, maybe sequestering carbon through that cash grain rotation that we were doing. However, we're losing a lot of nitrous oxide, right? And that is mainly due to the use of urea, nitrogen fertilizers. So when we kind of look at this whole system, if you were to add this up, you're actually still having emissions from that system, right? Versus when we look at this field and we do a prairie restoration, we're going to see that we're going to sequester a whole heck of a lot of carbon, right? We still have some nitrous oxide emissions, and that's just kind of inherently from the soil. But what is good is that because we're sequestering so much carbon, it kind of X's out that nitrous oxide emissions. So when you add up the change between these two systems, right, because the county could choose to just continue to farm this, right? But we are going to go through the work and restore it into prairie. So you look at the change between those two systems, and on this 100-acre field, we get about 68 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year sequestered by planting a prairie and restoring it to a prairie. So that's just one field. Okay, so we go through this for all of these fields that are enrolled in continuous cover program and within our restored through our Dane County Parks program. And we summarize this all in this really cool new dashboard that I just created. So please feel free to go look at it. So down here is a QR code to our dashboard. There's also a link at the bottom of the slide as well. And basically, it goes through and summarizes all of these emission reductions and removals that are through the CCP program and through our Dane County Parks restoration. It has a map. You can look at the different practices. You can compare the two programs. How much is park sequestering versus CCP? But the big thing here that I want to point out is at the top here for 2024. Our land-based programs, CCP, Dane County Parks, we sequestered about 3,500 metric tons of CO2 equivalent among both of those programs. Now, when I hear the number 3,500 metric tons of CO2 equivalent, to me, that's really hard for me to wrap my brain around. I can't really provide much meaning to it, honestly. It's kind of hard for me to comprehend. And so what's helpful for me is when I put this into context of our climate action plan, right? So we saw this graph at the beginning, right? What we're emitting through our county operations, and then what do we have the potential to sequester through our land operations? And so this for 2024, we are emitting about 17,000 metric tons as a county, like through our county operations. And we sequestered about 3,500 metric tons. So the goal is to get to our 2030 goal that we're going to continue to cut emissions, but we're also going to continue to perennialize, right? So that eventually our 2030, we can get emissions and our sequestration equal. And so that brings us to how we're going to get to that goal, and this gives us an opportunity. I showed this graph before. We have quite a bit of land that the Dane County Parks owns that is still within agriculture. And again, it's an annual-based agriculture system, and we can look at it's about 3,500 acres, and so we can look at how we can work within our staff to build our capacity to be able to get to these acreages and be able to replant prairies in these areas. As Gregg and I have been talking a lot about science, one main point I always like to bring up is that, yes, conservation is a solution to climate change. It's not the only solution, but it is a solution. It's part of, it's in your toolbox, right? It's a tool in your toolbox. And we really need conservation. But for conservation to happen, we really need people. We need conservation professionals working with landowners to help them perennialize their systems. We have an incredibly robust volunteer force on our Dane County Parks. If you haven't volunteered with our park system, please do. It's a wonderful experience, and you learn a lot. But again, it's just the importance of that really, although we love to nerd out on the science and learn about how these things happen, people is really at the center of this as well. So with that, that's all I have. So, all right.
Awesome, thank you. Just a note, you will be getting a copy of the slides, so any of those links or QR codes or graphs you'll be able to see afterwards. If for some reason MailChimp doesn't want to send you the email, just reach out to us and we'll make sure you get a copy. It'll come in an email, yep. We do have some time for some Q&A. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Hi, thank you, good morning, that was great. Two questions for either one of you guys. You guys talked a lot about soil. I'm curious about wetlands, and especially for Dane County, if that's part of your guys' math as well. And then considering probably more frequently people in this room have Kentucky bluegrass rather than farm fields, I'm curious how that compares if you translate from Kentucky bluegrass to perennials instead.
Okay, I'll take the wetland question mainly because Gregg is probably annoyed with me because I asked him so much about this. Because we are at the county, we're doing a lot of wetland restoration work actually. And from a carbon standpoint, it is really complex because yes, wetlands build carbon because, I mean, you have that wetness period, right? Which kind of slows down that decomposition and that turnover of carbon, right? So you can build carbon in wetlands. The thing, okay, so this is where maybe visualize some of those graphs on emissions, because wetlands also have the potential to emit methane as well. And so this is where quantifying it is really difficult. This is on my work plan for some year. What year it is, I'm not entirely sure, but to try to quantify those benefits, we're doing it, like within our department, we're doing a lot of wetland restoration as we know the water quality benefits of wetlands, but also to build flood resiliency. So we have a really large wetland restoration project going on in Black Earth Creek watershed near the town of Mazomanie, and mainly that was in response to a lot of the 2018 flooding. So from a greenhouse gas standpoint, we don't really have the methods to quantify it just yet. Second question was Kentucky bluegrass, right? Okay, yep. So we have had this question a lot before too, as people are putting in like rain gardens and stormwater basins and things like that, in an area that was once turf, and then putting in these perennialized systems. Again, the big question, or the big question is quantifying it. Is we don't really necessarily have that methodology to of like what would it look like to convert that that Kentucky bluegrass system into more of like a prairie-like type system, because really they're both kind of perennial, right? And so So we don't necessarily have the methodology to get to that answer just yet. So
I just want to add from a wetland standpoint, the land use change piece is big. So like starting a wetland, you're going to have a major flux of methane. You've got methanotrophs. Most farmland soils are consuming methane. They're aerobic. As soon as you turn them anaerobic, the methanotrophs are going to start taking that carbon and generating methane. And so you're going to have an immediate kind of like flux of a potent greenhouse gas like methane, which is about 30 times more potent than CO2. And then over time, because of the anaerobic conditions and the lack of oxygenation in those sediments, you're going to get accrual of carbon. So the long-term trajectory is probably a significant net sink. You think about anybody who's ever farmed or looked at a muck soil by a river, they're black. They're essentially histosols, almost entirely organic matter. So that's maybe the long-term trajectory of that. But early on, they're going to be a net emitter, right? Bluegrass is a perennial grass. It has a short root system, so maybe like 30 centimeters or something like that, which is not the same as a tall grass prairie, which is going to go down a couple meters, depending on the soil. But it's a lot better than continuous tilled corn. So I mean, when you think about like it's a trade-off in a land use change piece, like a well-managed lawn or golf course, like not even diving into the chemicals associated with that, just from a carbon standpoint, it's a lot better than having a cornfield that you're tilling and destroying aggregation.
Thank you.
Hi. First, thank you. That was fabulous. I'm really glad you're doing this. I'm Sherry Gruder. I'm with Extension, and we have a US DOE grant to look at large-scale renewable energy siting and also engaging farmers in it. But one of the things is planting prairie plantings underneath, not just for pollinators, but also for what it does to build the land, especially if it's going to be under there for 25, 30 years. And I'm wondering, there's a research station at Kagansa that UW has to look at a number of impacts of things, that you could grow, like agrivoltaics around large-scale solar. But I'm wondering if you've thought also of looking at that from, the prairie, obviously not a tall grass prairie, but from the prairie mix and the sequestration that could happen also in solar fields. And if you haven't done it, I recommend that you please do, because we could use the data.
yeah, so great question. We are doing some monitoring on our county-owned solar fields. So that would be the solar field that's at the Dane County Airport, and then right outside of the landfill as well. Yep. So I thought it was going to be really scary to sample out there, but apparently they don't bury anything. I didn't realize that, is that everything is above ground, and so that's super great. Yeah, and on that note as well, our Land Conservation Division is also involved in, it's MG&E site that's south of town near Oregon. I forgot what Taito? Yes, correct, yes, Taito. So, we were actually involved in cost sharing the remote collars for sheep to graze sheep underneath that solar field. So that's kind of another thing that we're looking at as well, is how can that work within some of our agriculture systems as well. So yeah.
I just didn't get to mention it. Have any of you read the book? There's a book that just came out by Paul Hawken. Paul Hawken is the reason why we have ESG. He wrote The Ecology of Commerce and started businesses measuring their footprint. But anyway, he just wrote a book called Carbon, the Book of Life, and he said that we have been villainizing carbon, and yet it's so essential to how we live, and then how does that relate to climate change? And I've only started it, but I just want you all to know that it's out there. It just came out.
This looks like a good book. We were talking about it as a staff a little bit ago. We have time for one more audience question, so this will be the last one.
Thank you. This was wonderful. So replacing land where food may have been being grown although it might have been corn for ethanol, and that's a total other boondoggle. But, so you can do that in Dane County, but what about the food supply and putting in perennials? And just my pet question is, why aren't we growing more low bush blueberries? You know, there's all these other berries that are perennial and fruit trees, but that's a good one.
Okay, that is a great question and something that we always kind of grapple with, right? Is that it is taking land out of production. That's one why I really, really like the CCP program, is because it does offer those options for perennializing, but still producing. So you can do a grazing plan, right? So that's perennializing, but still still supporting livestock, right? You can also do agroforestry systems, which I'm not entirely. I would have to talk with our conservation planners as to like what specific species you can do through that. But there's a lot of open opportunities to do like hazelnuts and things like that, right? So perennials that you can then utilize. And so I really like the CCP program because it is more. It's almost like a working lands version of the Conservation Reserve program, which I really like because you can still be producing off the land while perennializing it. That switch from corn and soybean, right, more of our traditional agriculture systems, there is an argument that yes, we are taking land out of production for that. It's really, when you look at the grand scheme of things, it is a very small acreage amount that we're taking out of production. And I feel, and I think Gregg can talk more to this, is that we're doing a lot of research on how to intensify production on smaller acreages. So that, we can have, I guess, kind of both in a way of production agriculture, but as well as looking at certain fields for us in our Dane County Parks that are really close to water bodies, right? Or typically are really close to water bodies. So how can we perennialize those as well?
Yeah, I just want to add the why not food piece. It's because of what, as a society, we put a price tag on, right? And what market forces are driving farmer choice in the region. So in my mind, if we were to valorize or put some sort of price tag on the carbon sequestered and the pollinator services and the water quality, we would really quickly probably see a flip in what the landscape looks like, but we're not doing that. And so we see 30% of our corn crop going into our fuel tanks. We see a ton of farmers still doing, nobody's using a moldboard plow anymore, but we're still using chisel plows kind of across the board everywhere. And so in my mind, it's less of a biophysical question and much more of a socio-political question. Like, what do we value as a society, and what are we willing to valorize and put a price tag on? So in some ways, it's rallying up at Capitol Hill, and it's also what we decide to purchase and what we decide is meaningful to us.
Awesome. And we like to end a lot of these programs by asking our speakers one final question, maybe in 30 seconds or less. If you could just kind of lay out your dream, your vision for carbon sequestration for the future, either in our area or bigger picture. I know, try 30 seconds or less, that's hard.
Well, I'd love to see that 30% of our corn crop go away that's going to ethanol, and just plant it all back to a prairie or something. Like, if it's not feeding people, we don't need it. Let's find energy elsewhere. I'd also like to see us have an agricultural landscape that's primarily diversified, heavily perennial, and focused on food, water, and soil. And getting excited about carbon sequestration for all of the kind of magical, biological, scientific things it does for us, and not this obsession with like putting a price tag on a ton of carbon so that Google can have an AI center somewhere.
I'll only share this because none of our park staff is here, and none of you are allowed to say this to our park staff. But I want a restored prairie, and I want bison grazing it. Because I feel like we can do it, because we have a zoo at the county, right? So we can do it. But again, they would probably just shake their head and roll their eyes at me. Just management implications, right? Yeah, that's my dream.
Help me in thanking our speakers today. I hope you all enjoyed today's program, learned a little something, maybe have a little bit more appreciation for the soil that's beneath our feet, whether you're visiting Dane County Parks soon or whether it's just the land and prairie around your office or your home. Maybe you're looking for some action items that you could take away from this program. A few announcements before we go. I want to thank our sponsor one more time, Good Oak Ecological Services. Can we give them a round of applause, please? Like I mentioned, you will get a follow-up email with the slides and a recording. Just reach out if you don't see that in your inbox by next week. There's also feedback forms at the table, paper copy if you want to fill those out. Give us some of your feedback for this program today. I'll also send it out digitally in the follow-up email. Feel free to leave those here or return them by the name tags. We'll also reuse your name tags, so if you could take those off before you go, and we'll take them back at the table. Any plates that you have can go by the sink in the back corner. If you have any peels or extra food, there are a couple compost bins. Just look for the signage. And we hope to see you at one of the upcoming programs, either all around Dane County next week. That would be a Dane County Park that you'd be visiting, and we could take a short walk around and look at the prairie. Yeah, there you go. And our summit on November 7th. We hope to see you there and just continue this energy, this joy, this inspiration that we get by all being together and talking about sustainability initiatives. Feel free to hang out, grab another cup of coffee and some food. We have this space for a little bit more, and enjoy the rest of your day.